Hello and welcome to Strange Audio Parts, the audio-only companion to my YouTube channel, Strange Brain Parts. I'm your host, Alan Cassavetes. In this episode, I'm going to review all the titles released during the first 2 years of Black Label, the mature imprint established by DC. But first, let's begin with an introduction to Black Label. What is it and why does it exist? In 2018, DC launched Black Label, an imprint specifically created for darker, more adult superhero material. Although in 2020, when Vertigo was officially shuttered, Black Label took over reprinting evergreen Vertigo titles, like Sandman, Preacher, and Fables. Of the 40-plus titles Black Label has published to date, only 2 are original concepts. The rest are miniseries based on existing DC superhero properties. Black Label also publishes adult pop-up imprints, such as Hill Comics and the Murphyverse, which are Batman-centric titles primarily created by Sean Murphy. It also publishes the Sandman Universe line of titles. Basically, this imprint is designed to publish superhero stories that may or may not be considered canon. Whether they are depends on the impact of the story and the whims of editorial. For the most part, they are a cross between Elseworlds with a hint of Vertigo, usually starring popular properties. Black Label launched with some controversy. The first title, Batman Damned, became infamous for showing bat junk in the first issue, at least in the first print run. Reprints and digital editions have the Batarang encased in shadow. Officially, the appearance was explained as a production error. The colors had to be brightened during the printing process, and once brightened, that revealed Batman's privates. Which is a pretty ridiculous way to spin this incident, especially to anyone familiar with the printing process, or has any sense of logic. For whatever reason, this full frontal exposure caused a stir online, on talk shows, and at DC. It resulted in the second issue being delayed to have the artwork changed, presumably to remove any nudity. I'd guess the scene with Harley Quinn had some last-minute changes. The third issue was also rescheduled 5 times to accommodate changes. Anyway, this weird outrage led to a lot of editorial changes, and it set the tone for Black Label in general. In fact, one series, a religious satire called Second Coming, was pulled by the creators due to the extensive changes that needed to be made. The other history of the DC Universe, which would have been published alongside Batman Damned, had its orders cancelled. It would be published 2 years later with significant changes, although it was not announced what caused the delay. Presumably, it was for language and nudity. So despite its mature subject matter, Black Label self-censored itself almost immediately. Nudity seems to be completely discouraged, and depending on the series, adult language is either censored or uncensored. It's an odd choice that is somewhat inconsistent. It seems the deciding factor is whether it's character appropriate or not. That is, would the character drop an F-bomb in the mainstream universe, or is the language being used because of the adult label on the comic? To date, Black Label has released a fair amount of material, a lot of which is Batman-related. So let's take a look at these titles in release order and see what's good, what's bad, and what's ugly. The first title published from Black Label was Batman Damned, a 3-issue series written by Brian Azzarello and illustrated by Lee Bermeo. The series itself is a supernatural horror story involving the Batman. It begins with the death of the Joker. An injured Batman cannot recall what happened during their fight, or whether he's responsible for that death. During flashbacks, it's revealed that Bruce Wayne's parents had a less than happy marriage. And during the incident that led to their deaths, Bruce was also killed. But he sold his soul to the Enchantress, who returned him to life, and he went on to become the Batman. There are a few more plot twists, and the ending is a huge surprise, so let's leave it as a brief summary. First of all, the artwork by Lee Bermeo is just outstanding, especially Gotham itself. It really looks like a dirty Gothic landscape overrun by crime. All the supporting characters, such as Constantine, Deadman, and Etrigan, have a reasonably unique design, but they aren't so unique that they aren't easily identifiable. Quite simply, the book looks perfect. The story is pretty tight too. The writer, Brian Azzarello, writes something that is reasonably straightforward, although the end gets a touch oblique and it is abrupt. In the first issue, his recurring motif of quirky wordplay does stand out, and it's hard not to notice. But this motif thankfully disappears over the next few issues. Overall, it's pretty solid, and it stands up on a reread. The only slight criticism is the lettering. The narrator, John Constantine, has a running dialogue throughout the series that's done in a cursive font. However, it's placed on the artwork without a caption box, which was not ideal. It tended to blend in and be somewhat difficult to read at times. This is kind of minor, but it slightly annoyed me. Here comes another Batman title, Last Night on Earth, a 3-issue series written by Scott Snyder and illustrated by Greg Capullo. In 3 issues, we get a very apocalyptic story about a freshly awakened Batman who needs to remove the controlling overlord, Omega. Batman encounters many different dangers as he attempts to discover how the world ended and how to fix the problem. The beginning is slightly awkward as the premise is being established. It begins with a simulation, and then hard cuts to Bruce Wayne being told he's delusional. All the staff that were attending him were characters in that delusion. Naturally, as a reader, one has to think Bruce is being lied to, and now he's in a simulation and his mind is being messed with. Then, when he's released, he discovers the talking, disembodied head of the Joker in a jar. This surreal development further strengthens the reader's belief that a simulation is ongoing. At least, that's what it seemed like to me. However, the story is being straightforward in that respect. So don't overthink the premise, like your humble narrator. Overall, it's not a bad possible future for the Batman. The writer, Scott Snyder, does write a very good Clown Prince version of the Joker. His running dialogue and narration is quite good and character appropriate, considering the circumstances. It's a thrill ride of bad situations that seem quite hopeless, but it ends on a very hopeful note. Critically speaking, the reader will arrive at the true identity of Omega long before the story reveals it, but it still works. It's a solid adventure story that takes place in an alternate future. Greg Capullo's artwork has never been better. In fact, it was so good and evolved, I didn't even recognize his style at first. I highly suggest he keep the inker, Jonathan Glapion, on retainer, like Jim Lee does with Scott Williams. The two work very well together. Next is Superman Year 1, a 3-issue series written by Frank Miller and illustrated by John Romita Jr. This is Frank Miller's modernized take on Superman's origin and early days. Yep, it sure is. While Frank Miller deserves much respect for the work he's done, I'm not sure what happened to him over the last 20 years. I can't say he doesn't put a lot of thought into the plot or the themes he's looking to explore, but there's just something incoherent in the material. It's almost like he's giving the audience what they want, but he's doing it out of utter contempt. It's like there's a consistent through line of anger and bitterness in the material. It makes for a difficult reading experience. Next up is Harleen, a 3-issue series written and illustrated by Stepan Sejic. The story is about Harleen Quinzel and the Joker meeting and how it develops into a romance, which is what this series is, a romance comic. If you enjoy Stepan Sejic's writing and artwork, then you'll probably like this miniseries. His manga-influenced style is in full bloom, and it's a little more coherent than his most well-known series, Sunstone. Like Sunstone, everyone in Harleen is very pretty and idealized to the point of distraction. That being said, I personally find his writing to be dull and very surface level. The running internal dialogue of Harleen is pretty basic insight into the character. It's supposed to be intimate and revealing, but it's just long and overwritten, with nothing that indicates a depth worth exploration. I know, there's plenty of people who enjoy and identify with his melodramatic, young adult meanderings. I get it, but I don't care for it, personally. This Harley Quinn series is followed by another Harley Quinn series, Joker Harley Criminal Sanity, an 8-issue series written by Cami Garcia and illustrated by Miko Suiyan. In some ways, this is an origin story for a new iteration of Harley Quinn. At least, that's where it lands in the end. It begins with Harley, a criminal profiler, attempting to help the Gotham police investigate a series of unsolved crimes. It's revealed early the criminal is the Joker, who takes an interest in the woman attempting to bring him to justice. The artwork is solid. The scenes that happen in the current timeline are in gray tones, while anything that happens in the past is in color. Originally, these past scenes appeared to be actual photographs that have been digitally tweaked to have a comic book appearance. This technique is ditched after a few issues, probably because it was too time-consuming to do the photo shoots. It was an interesting experiment while it lasted. One severe criticism is the story uses the tired, modern trope of a serial criminal as a romanticized psychopath whose elaborate crimes reveal some oblique, artistic message. The cipher that unlocks that message is the criminal's pathology. It's very much in line with other works, such as the novels of James Patterson, or more recently, the TV series Hannibal. It may be a concept that's character appropriate, but that doesn't make it less worn out. The scene where the Joker plans his own arrest, and then is released on the word of Harley, does break the story pretty thoroughly. It doesn't ever recover from this highly dubious act. In fact, it gets even more ridiculous after that. Which is highly unfortunate because, for 6 issues, it's reasonably well done. But wow, the final 2 issues just eviscerate everything that happens before it. In fact, the final issue is so contrived and laden with bad devices that it feels insulting to a degree. To be fair, it's no worse than any other generic serial criminal fiction in modern times. Still, it's very disappointing how quickly it plunges from being solid to being absolutely mediocre. Next is Joker Killer Smile, a 3-issue series written by Jeff Lemire and illustrated by Andrea Sorrentino. Unfortunately, this story has a pretty tired premise. A psychiatrist assigned to the Joker decides to cure him and winds up going crazy instead. The end. Not a terrible comic, but not exactly original or all that interesting. You get Andrea Sorrentino artwork, so that's a plus. But Jeff Lemire's script is very uninspired. At this point, looking at all the Black Label titles so far, it seems these Joker-related titles have story ideas that were probably generated by editorial and then assigned to interested writers. Because, quite honestly, these ideas all seem rather generic and tread some well-known territory in other media. Swapping in Bat characters doesn't revive a premise that's been beaten to death by others. Next is The Last God, a 12-issue series written by Philip Kennedy Johnson and illustrated by Riccardo Federici. This is a straightforward, modern fantasy story and the only new original property published by Black Label during its first year. It's steeped in mythos and world building, with the story focused on stopping an ancient evil god. While there's nothing wrong with the execution, it's just not a story that appealed to me whatsoever. Hard fantasy fans might enjoy this title quite a lot, but it didn't do anything for me, and I bailed after the 3rd issue. I can't say it's bad though, it's just a style of story that isn't for me, and there's only so much I can endure for the sake of a review. Up next is The Question, The Deaths of Vic Sage, a 4-issue series written by Jeff Lemire and illustrated by Dennis Cowan and Bill Sienkiewicz. The Question finds himself trying to defeat the literal personification of evil in Hub City. The summary may be short, but it's sweet. I have no problem suggesting this to fans of the 80s Question series. Overall, this is a tribute to the late Denny O'Neil's era of The Question. So much so that the original art team of Dennis Cowan and Bill Sienkiewicz provide the artwork. The story looks like it could have easily taken place in the early days of the 80s series. However, Google is a thing, and that didn't exist until well after the series ended. So the time period is modern, but it looks and feels like the late 80s. Critically speaking, the time-traveling drug trip was a bit unnecessary and seemed to pad the series into 4 issues when 3 would have done just fine. Also, a drug trip to receive illumination, so to speak, is a pretty tired trope. The characters of Myra and Wesley Furman are changed to be brother and sister instead of husband and wife, which was a change I didn't quite get. I'm not sure if Lemire misremembered their relationship or whether there was a reason he made them siblings. If there was a reason, I may have missed it. It's not a change that ruins the story, it's just one that made my continuity senses ping. Otherwise, the series lands exactly where it needs to in the final issue. It's a note-perfect ending. And if I may say, I think Lemire channeled Denny O'Neil in those final pages. It delivers a message without being blunt about what it's communicating. It might not be a very hopeful message, but it is very appropriate. The Question was followed by Dark Knight Returns, The Golden Child, a one-shot story written by Frank Miller and illustrated by Raphael Grandpa. Frank Miller returns for another installment in the Dark Knight franchise. Yep, he sure does. The best thing about this is the artwork by Raphael Grandpa. It looks like a perfect blend of Frank Miller's 2001 Dark Knight style and Frank Whiteley's overall style. It's actually ideal for the material, and it made the story much more readable. I only gave it a surface-level read, but it seems to be a commentary about youth movements trying to reclaim the power the older generation assumes. It could be Miller's observation about the Occupy movement and the 2016 presidential election in America. It's definitely symbolic to a degree, but I couldn't find myself caring enough to try and decode the political message. Next is Wonder Woman: Dead Earth, a 4-issue series written and illustrated by Daniel Warren Johnson. Wonder Woman wakes up in the distant future to a post-apocalyptic world. All of her hero friends are dead and gone, or they left the planet. What remains of the human race fights daily for survival against brutal, inhuman monsters. Diana pledges to save a group of humans by relocating them to Themyscira, her home island. But Themyscira is also a destroyed wasteland. It's here she discovers what happened to bring about this dead planet. Going in, I had low expectations for the series. However, I was pleasantly surprised at the twists and turns, and the ultimate explanation for the apocalypse. Everything is neat and tidy, and very organic. A few details, such as her bracelets helping to contain her power, and Batman's cynical faith that Diana will eventually achieve redemption, were really nice touches. In fact, the whole series is very well done. It's a good examination of Wonder Woman's strengths and flaws. And when her flaws are exploited or she's in a moment of weakness, her strengths become terrifying. This brings us to the end of Black Label's 2019 publishing output. The first title published in 2020 was Harley Quinn and the Birds of Prey, a 3-issue series written by Amanda Conner and Jimmy Palmiotti, illustrated by Amanda Conner. This is a typical Harley Quinn madcap romp. Other than some adult language, there's nothing in the series that requires a mature label. It is, from what I can tell, just another Amanda Conner and Jimmy Palmiotti comic starring Harley Quinn. So if you enjoyed their previous run, then, well, here's some more. Conner's artwork is pretty awesome, but beyond that, it had a very, very low entertainment value for me. The 12-issue series, Strange Adventures, was the next title published, written by Tom King and illustrated by Mitch Gerads and Doc Shaner. Adam Strange returns to Earth with his partner, Alana, where he documents his time fighting a war on the planet Rann. The book becomes a bestseller, and Adam becomes a media sensation. However, the murder of a person who confronted Adam at a signing leads to a criminal investigation. Mr. Terrific investigates Adam to determine his guilt or innocence in this murder. This leads Mr. Terrific to uncover the truth about Adam's time on Rann. Obviously, this is a series that deserves a much deeper evaluation. It's a story told in 3 tiers, which, in my opinion, is based on the old adage, there are 3 sides to every story, yours, mine, and the truth. There's the story Adam tells in the novel, there's the story told by the history of events Mr. Terrific uncovers, and then there's what really happened. To briefly continue the 3 tiers metaphor, Rann is a 3-tiered society. Most pages are broken into 3 panels. There are 3 voices telling the story, the writer, Tom King, and the artists, Mitch Gerads and Doc Shaner. There are 3 main characters, Mr. Terrific, Adam Strange, and Alana Strange. Naturally, most fictional stories are structured in 3 acts. The brief look at the story elements implies much more to discover. Thematically, it may be an examination of the stories we tell to create heroes, and whether those heroes can survive that level of scrutiny. So it gently explores propaganda as a tool for a society's self-preservation. But none of that pretentious meandering answers the basic question, is it any good? Yes, it is. Although it does contain many of Tom King's basic situations and character traits, especially when compared to the prior series, Mr. Miracle. There is a seemingly hopeless war with a traumatized hero who makes a questionable decision involving the life of his child. The hero has a strong female partner that endures these trials beside him, but has a slightly different perspective on the events. Of course, the resolutions are different, as are the characters and their wants and needs, but the basic template does exist. That being said, it is good as a fractured but linear story. It's not something that can be breezed through in one sitting. There's a lot going on, and it continually cuts back and forth to contrast the past with the present. It does demand the reader's attention. Critically speaking, it may be a bit longer than necessary. Not that any issue feels like filler, but the story does seem to drag in places. For example, the dangerous war on Rann, contrasted with Adam and Alana's domestic boredom, is well established, perhaps a bit too often. Mr. Terrific's meticulous investigation is done well, and quite honestly, was the most engaging aspect of the story. In other words, there are parts where the story breathes a bit too much, and the pace could have been tighter. But I have to reiterate, these are preliminary thoughts. My opinion may change on a reread. Personally, I think Adam gets done dirty for the sake of the story. And quite possibly, King did this to distance this series from being compared too heavily to Mr. Miracle. That being said, if you approach Strange Adventures as a story that's not part of continuity, which I think is a very reasonable presumption, then Adam's downfall is story appropriate, if not a little forced. Next was Birds of Prey, a one-shot story written by Brian Azzarello and illustrated by Emanuela Lupacchino. Drug lords are attempting to establish themselves in Gotham, and Harley Quinn, newly released from Task Force X, is being stalked and hunted by the Joker. The story moves rather quickly, and the artwork is competent, so it's not a terrible read, but it's also not all that interesting. I'm reasonably certain the only reason this was a Black Label release is because Renee Montoya is a traitor with heroic motivations, which is a necessary plot beat that's a little outside the established mainstream character. Otherwise, if the language was toned down, it could have easily been a one-shot in the DC universe. Although the ultimate motivation for the story was clearly to be a tie-in with the movie that was released that same year. Part of me wants to suggest this was an abandoned plot for that movie. Because the Joker appears a few times, he's only seen in shadow, or he's conveniently off-panel, and he has no lines. It reads like a movie plot where they didn't have the rights to show the character in full. So they were coy and just suggested it was the Joker, instead of showing him outright. It seems like a weird choice for a comic. The next 3 one-shot titles are filler material that are only worth a brief mention. First, there's The Last God Sourcebook, written by Philip Kennedy Johnson and Dan Telfer. Illustrations were done by various artists. This is, literally, a role-playing guide for dungeon masters who might want to create a campaign using the mythology of this comic. That's all that needs to be said. Batman Smile Killer is next, written by Jeff Lemire and illustrated by Andrea Sorrentino. A young Bruce Wayne watches a disturbing show for children and turns to murder. I'm pretty sure this is a leftover or edited out subplot from the prior series, Joker Killer Smile. Overall it's coherent, but somewhat trivial, and the story doesn't really go anywhere. Finally, there's Joker Harley Criminal Sanity Sourcebook, written by Cami Garcia and Edward Kurz, illustrated by various artists. At best, this is supplementary material and alternate covers that don't enhance the original series. It's just filler that would show up at the end of a trade paperback. Next is Batman 3 Jokers, written by Jeff Johns and illustrated by Gary Frank. The story is presented as a mystery. 3 crimes are committed simultaneously by 3 individuals who look like the Joker. Who the real Joker is, and what that endgame might be, is the focus of the story. Basically, it's learned that Joker is trying to create a better Joker, which is a meaningless reveal that goes exactly nowhere. I did a review of the series when it was released in 2020, and my objection to the material still stands. To a degree, it's softened by the possibility that this likely isn't canon. It's an unnecessary sequel to Alan Moore's Killing Joke, which didn't need further elaboration. All the ambiguities or interpretations in the original story are what made the Killing Joke work. Filling them in grounds the story to one mundane possibility that doesn't add to the source material. Really, it's the writer, Jeff Johns, filling in the mysteries for no good reason. Honestly, if it was a story that didn't try so hard to be a Killing Joke sequel, I might not be as critical as I have been. Because objectively, it's not terrible or incompetent. But looking at it in the context of it being a sequel, or at least a piece of work that heavily evokes the Killing Joke, it's just a bad copy that doesn't carry the weight of the original. Up next is Hellblazer Rise and Fall, written by Tom Taylor and illustrated by Derek Robertson. John Constantine investigates a series of murders that have a connection to his childhood misadventures. This is a rather light-hearted, Vertigo-adjacent series. Technically it's horror, but it lacks the serious edge of the original Hellblazer series, and Constantine is a mere shadow of his former self. Originally, John Constantine was a manipulator who had no friends and used people to prevent whatever evil might be plaguing him, and he bore the mental consequences of those actions. He was not a good man. He was barely tolerated by anyone who knew him. Anyone who did help Constantine did it under duress, or because of a duty to stop evil, or due to ignorance of what they were getting involved with. Constantine exploits people's ignorance or the contempt they have for him. Really, that's a fundamental part of the character. In Rise and Fall, the supporting cast are quite willing to help him without any coercion whatsoever. Even Lucifer, yes, Lucifer, the ruler of hell, and the king of all the demons Constantine regularly defeats, is quite happy to help. Also, for no good reason, Constantine is suddenly gay or bisexual, it's not specified which, and he makes out with Lucifer. From my memory, as someone who has read nearly the entire 300-issue run, he was very clearly straight. But for the sake of argument, let's say his sexuality is flexible. After all, it could make character sense if he's willing to do anything to achieve his goals. Here's where I have to insert a correction. Canonically, it was established that Constantine was bisexual. It was a character beat that wasn't frequently used in the Vertigo series, and your humble narrator overlooked it. So Constantine wasn't suddenly bisexual or clearly straight. This was an error. Moving on. What he most certainly wouldn't do is make out with a demon, especially the king of demons. That's not a bragging point for him. In fact, it would be contradicting every principle he follows. He may have worked with demons and questionable individuals, but again, they were a means to an end. And those demons and bad people usually got their comeuppance at some point. So to get intimate with someone who literally personifies everything he's spent his life fighting, well, that breaks the story. Not to mention, his sexuality has no bearing on the story itself. It's a character beat that seems a little capricious. Putting that aside, the story is just fine. It's not great, but it's not incompetent. Derek Robertson's art is pretty darn good, and rather appropriate for the character. It's a shame he hasn't had a chance to illustrate Hellblazer before now. Next is The Last God, Songs of Lost Children, a one-shot written by Dan Waters and illustrated by Steve Beach. I do believe the original series was still being published when this one-shot came out. This is a side story that takes place before the events of the original miniseries. If you like that, you'll like this. Next is the former Vertigo series, American Vampire, 1976. This 10-issue series was written by Scott Snyder and illustrated by Raphael Albuquerque. The original team of the Vertigo series returned to give this title an apocalyptic conclusion. This is not a series for anyone unfamiliar with American Vampire. It relies on its own continuity and mythology. While there is room for more stories, it acts as an overall conclusion to the saga started by Scott Snyder. Notably, it brings Skinner Sweet's story to an end. Sweet was, arguably, the protagonist of the series, even though he wasn't in every story. However, his creation began the unique American vampire bloodline. As an ending, it works, but it's more than a little forced. It also seems somewhat rushed in places, as some scenes suddenly transition without explanation, and some of the action is a bit over the top, but its intent was to be a thrill ride that finishes the series off, which it accomplishes. Honestly, the original series seemed to be a lot more grounded and character-oriented. This finale is an action movie with vampires and various demonic beings, so it's boiled down to the basics and kind of surface level. Personally, it made me feel ambivalent. Next is Rorschach, a 12-issue series written by Tom King and illustrated by Jorge Fornes. This is another Tom King work that needs more than a surface-level examination, so consider this my initial preliminary thoughts. The story begins with the death of a Rorschach character and then works backwards to fill in the details of how this person became Rorschach and why he took the actions he did. We also learn about the backstory of his accomplice, the Kid, a woman with a deeply troubled past. One of the most compelling elements, because it happens unexpectedly, is a metatextual look at the comic book creators Steve Ditko, Otto Binder, and Frank Miller. At least, Watchmen Universe versions of these real people. The common element between these three people is they became hardcore in their beliefs at some point in their life. Ditko is well known for being a staunch objectivist. Binder believed aliens were at least partially responsible for life on Earth. And Miller, well, he seems to have become very reactionary. This series is firmly grounded in the Watchmen continuity, and it contains elements of the HBO Watchmen series. It takes place in modern times, decades after the squid attack in New York that ended the original Watchmen series. However, the repercussions of that event still resonate. The threat of another squid attack permeates the culture in various, subtle ways. For some, like the Kid, they've grown up with this threat hanging over their head. They don't know about a world where a squid attack wasn't an imminent possibility. So the unintended consequences of Adrian Veidt's plan was swapping the fear of atomic annihilation with the fear of an alien invasion. I would say the overall subtext is one concerning how some beliefs can connect to other adjacent beliefs until they all combine into one conspiracy theory type of situation, and how some people are predisposed, due to their experiences, to adopt radical points of view, then act on them to create a better world. You could compare it to Veidt's singular conspiracy to create a utopia with a shared worldwide threat, to the smaller squid-related conspiracy that seems equally threatening and apocalyptic to an individual. The only difference is scale. This may not appeal to many people, but I find it an interesting piece of work. King may be stretching his abilities a bit, but I think he's reasonably successful. Worth a mention is the artwork by Jorge Fornes. It just works for the material, and it gave me a Gotham Central vibe. It's just so expressive and clean, while also feeling gritty. The coloring by Dave Stewart is stupidly good. I'm always amazed at how much he influences atmosphere with what looks like a simple color palette. It makes me sick how he effortlessly enhances a scene with limited but very appropriate color choices. Seriously, Stewart has perfect sensibilities for tone and subtlety. Another former Vertigo series is next. Sweet Tooth: The Return is a 6-issue series, written and illustrated by Jeff Lemire. This is an odd sequel, mainly because the original series came to a definitive conclusion. The story takes place 300 years after the original. At this point, mankind lives underground in caves to avoid the killer virus. Through experimentation, they managed to create a visual and biological copy of the former main character, Gus. This copy's entire purpose is to be released to the surface and infect the hybrid population with the new virus. If I had to guess, the only reason this miniseries exists is to potentially cash in on the Netflix adaptation, because it's kind of pointless. It has a drawn-out, convoluted premise that doesn't really go anywhere. It plays heavily on nostalgia by hitting classic beats from the original story, but that's all it is. It's a greatest hits type of story with a slight twist. Next is The Other History of the DC Universe, a 5-issue series written by John Ridley and illustrated by Giuseppe Camuncoli. Unfortunately, this is not a comic book. It's a novel with illustrations. Overall, it looks at the history of different people of color and their place within the ongoing continuity of events taking place in the DC Universe. Honestly, because of the format, I cannot review this as a comic book, because it isn't one. So this is a non-review, I guess you could say. It's a piece that I may circle back to at a future date, because it does look interesting. Finally, there's Batman Catwoman, a 12-issue series written by Tom King and primarily illustrated by Clay Mann. I have to wonder if the inspiration for this series was a response to the outrage at the Batman and Catwoman marriage fake-out done in the regular series. Anyway, this is a very fractured look at the relationship between Batman and Catwoman and the people behind the masks, Bruce Wayne and Selina Kyle. It also involves the presence of the Joker, who attempts to influence Selina to follow her criminal instincts. While I am a fan of brevity and not hammering home plot beats, sometimes the hopping around in time was a touch too fractured and confusing. This is definitely a piece that could have been well served by a consistent visual narrative with different artists, like Strange Adventures. While there are visual cues, notably Catwoman's costume, there are sometimes she isn't in costume and it's not immediately obvious when the event is taking place. This is not a critique of the art, which is well done by Clay Mann, but a critique of the narrative form. King is clearly experimenting, and visually, it's not as smooth as intended. Different visual styles would have made the narrative very cohesive. But unless you have a J.H. Williams, who can seemingly change his style on a whim, that's going to be a pretty difficult task for any artist. So this is King playing with the form and structure of a comic, which comes off as a method to disguise a story that is, essentially, a character examination, rather than a piece with a lot of subtext and interpretation. After all, the story is rather straightforward, but the jumbled events, arranged to fit issue-specific themes, give the appearance of complexity. Put another way, the structure is the star of the piece, not the characters. Still, it's a solid piece about a strong female protagonist. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love how it was structured. Your mileage may vary. This brings us to the end of the titles released on the Black Label Imprint during 2019 and 2020. It was a pretty mixed bag of mainly Batman-related titles. But my top 5 choices to read would be Rorschach, Strange Adventures, Wonder Woman, Dead Earth, Batman, Last Night on Earth, and Batman, Damned. Naturally, your tastes may differ. Out of the 20 titles looked at, those were the ones I would suggest if anyone asked. Alright, that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed this lengthy review session. Any ratings or reviews would be greatly appreciated. If you'd like to go a step further and directly support my humble audio and video offerings, I have a Patreon available at patreon.com/strangebrainparts. The link is in the description. As always, thank you for listening, and I will talk at you soon.